Alright, it's time for another edition of our Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series. And as always, Kubo takes and answers a variety of questions directly from fans over on his personal Q&A platform. And then we try to dissect those answers right here on the channel to see if there's anything of value to be found. And a lot of the time, Kubo's comments are a mix of light-hearted chatter and fluff, but sometimes we are given real, genuine insight into the story and world of Bleach that for whatever reason simply wasn't found in the original material. And as always, I'm not looking at every single answer he's ever given, nor even necessarily looking at them in any kind of chronological order. Mostly, I'm just trying to curate the answers that I find to be the most interesting and to have the most value, and then bring them to you. And so, speaking of which, this time the questions revolve around the topic of Zanpakutō fusion, which we looked at recently in a video about Dangai Ichigo, Giselle's strength, Mimihagi's name, and more. A huge thank you goes out to Tumblr user Wheelsome for providing the translations to the questions and answers and collating them all in one place. It is a big help, and there's a link in the description to where you too can find them, so make sure to go and check them out. Right, on with the latest roundup. We're going to begin with the topic of Zanpakutō fusion as something of an addendum to that other video I mentioned earlier, which you should go and check out if you haven't done so already. And of course, before we get started, consider hitting subscribe down below to help take the channel towards 300,000 subs by the end of the year. I do need your help to get us there. It is greatly appreciated. It's quick, easy, and free to do, so please do so if you haven't done already. And check out the Patreon as well, where you can take the support for this channel another step further, just like everyone on the credits of this video is doing. And again, it's a great big help. So, as I said, we recently took a closer look at Dangai Ichigo, Ichigo's transcendent form he achieved after not only training in the eponymous Dangai for 3 months straight, but more importantly, after accepting Zangetsu in all his forms as his power, as a part of him, and even allowing himself to be run through by the blade in the ultimate form of self-acceptance and understanding, thus learning the final Getsuga Tensho, seemingly his most powerful, sacrificial ability, and wrapping up the Rankar arc. Deicide is a fascinating little story arc, to be totally honest. In many ways, those 23 chapters feel like their own self-contained world, as so much of the context that fuels it, that drives that narrative, that conflict in particular, is both introduced in Deicide for the very first time, and then never really addressed again, at least not in such an overt way. All of the concepts surrounding the idea of transcendence, and yes, transcendence itself, are never really explored beyond the boundaries of Deicide. This idea that there are numerous planes of existence, that the presence of those who have ascended to said planes can no longer be felt by those beneath them, that someone's sheer reiatsu can become so strong as to erode the world around them, and yes, that at the end of evolution, a Zanpakutō and their Shinigami will fuse as one. Looking back on Deicide now, there is no doubt that both Ichigo and Aizen, but perhaps Aizen more so, truly became something unrecognisable, and I don't just mean on the surface. The way Isshin talks about Aizen during their battle is eerie, about how it feels like he's facing a ghost, how Aizen isn't really there. It felt completely new at the time, and then the concept was never really brought back, even though certain characters are clearly transcendent, even if certain aspects of it are brought forward, such as Aizen's reiatsu that can destroy things in his vicinity, even if the literal concept is never mentioned again. Anyway, the key point to take away here is the idea of fusing with one's Zanpakutō, and again, this is depicted interestingly throughout Deicide. As the Hogyoku begins to envelop Aizen in a shell, we can see it starting to run down his arms towards his hands, but initially his sword is clearly not yet fused with his arm. Even after Kisuke tries to kill him, and he becomes fully cocooned, he's not yet fused with his blade, even though that would maybe make sense. In fact, he quite literally isn't holding his blade in some shots. However, the change becomes obvious, dramatically so, after Yoruichi pummels Aizen in a massive explosion. At the end of chapter 403, Aizen emerges from the attack, from the dust and debris, and now it is quite clear that a transformation has taken place, and his blade appears to be fully, albeit messily, fused with his arm. The thing with this, though, is that it's hard to know if it's actually fused with his arm yet, or if the cocoon has simply enveloped his hand as well, but still the change is now obvious, to the point where it's weird, to be totally honest, that someone like Kisuke doesn't point it out. Once Gin kills Aizen, and he evolves into butterflies and fully transcending to become a being who, in his words, surpasses both Shinigami and Hollow, well, his fused arm looks much the same, and it's still difficult to determine exactly what's going on here, as he's still technically wearing the Hogyoku cocoon robe. The only real difference is that the look of the connective point between his hand and the blade has kind of become a bit neater. The truth is, the most overt change comes once the Hogyoku pushes Aizen to forcibly evolve beyond his limits, transforming him into Monster Aizen. At this point, any pretense of a Hogyoku cocoon is gone, and so Aizen's hand is revealed. Now, his arm is quite obviously fused with his blade fully, and his blade is literally an extension of his flesh. In some ways, Ichigo's fusion is actually both less and more conspicuous. Less so because he's wearing a black glove or black bindings that completely obscure his hand, but more so because it's obvious that said black bindings are simply a part of the Zanpakutō fusion, and his hand and arm have now become the hilt, as evidenced by the chain that wraps around him. It feels much more natural, and again, less messy and brutal than Aizen's fusion, and again, I've said it before, that comes about as a result of the means of their ascension. Ichigo's is organic, while Aizen's is artificial, and that is reflected in the appearance of their fused Zanpakutō. Anyway, Kubo was asked the following question about Zanpakutō fusion, which reads: does the form that Aizen and Ichigo achieved, where their Zanpakutō fused with their arms, have any precedent or official name? To which Kubo replied, there is a precedent, but the name has not been passed down, and then in brackets it reads, not survived. So this is pretty interesting. If there is a precedent, then it means this form has been achieved before, and yet if the name didn't survive, meaning it was likely lost to the ages, then it must surely predate none other than Ichibei himself, who has named every single phenomenon in the Soul Society, including Zanpakutō and the terms relating to it, such as Shikai and Bankai. But does that really make sense? I mean, how can that be? That feels like a pretty huge contradiction to me. Zanpakutō, at least as we know them, originated with Oetsu, who existed alongside Ichibei. The two essentially worked together to create the concept of Zanpakutō, with Oetsu coming up with the process to forge an Asauchi, and then Ichibei naming everything. Ichibei's power over names is in fact so great and godlike that he knows the name of every Asauchi even before they reach their Shinigami wielder, which is obviously insane. So for this name to be lost, to have not been passed down, to have escaped him somehow seems very odd, as it would imply it didn't come from Ichibei. But not only that, it implies Ichibei doesn't even know of it, which seems highly unlikely. For this specific form, that of fusing with your Zanpakutō as a blade, to have existed prior to Ichibei, then that means the idea of a Zanpakutō as a blade predates Ichibei too, which at least to my knowledge doesn't seem to work, as there's just no way Oetsu predates Ichibei, right? This would also mean that there would have been Shinigami, or perhaps just souls wielding Zanpakutō, who became so powerful, so in tune with their Zanpakutō, and again, became transcendent so many years ago. I kind of feel like there are only a few possibilities, realistic possibilities, for who could have done this. If the Soul King ever possessed anything like a Zanpakutō, which seems highly unlikely, Or maybe even someone like Oetsu himself, but as far as we can tell, he isn't truly transcendent, and again, Ichibei would surely know the name if that were the case. Hell, Ichibei even states in the manga that his Ichimonji was the first evolved Zanpakutō, meaning the first to achieve and transform, using what would become bankai. So that again muddies the water. I've said it many times, but we are in desperate need of a concrete timeline of events and characters for the Primordial Age. At the very least, some insight into the pre-Gotei 13 Soul Society would be extremely useful, as Aizen clashes with Ichigo. He is surprised by the fact that his arm has fused with his Zanpakutō, and it seems like he didn't expect for this to happen. This is news to him as much as it is to us, before he wonders if this is the natural form of the Zanpakutō. All of this is just him hypothesizing. So, for Aizen of all characters to not have expected this, and to apparently not know what it represents, after all, he's only making an estimation, that really does mean that this knowledge is simply not available. As an aside, obviously, like I said, there is a precedent for this being a thing, the idea of Zanpakutō fusion. What interests me is the correlation between Zanpakutō fusion and the final Getsuga Tensho. Are they one and the same? I think they must be, because when Ichigo actually activates the final Getsuga Tensho itself, he literally becomes one with Getsuga. And again, as I mentioned in that previous video about Dangai Ichigo, that is really only possible because he's already, as Dangai Ichigo, one with Zangetsu. Even more so than the idea of the blade is me. And we know that Isshin already knows of the existence of the final Getsuga Tensho, having presumably tried to achieve it once himself before, and presumably having failed to do so. But the fact that the final Getsuga Tensho is already prior knowledge kind of, I guess, lends itself to this idea that there is precedent, but again it kind of comes down to how intrinsically tied together the two actually are. Basically what I'm asking is, could Ichigo have achieved the final Getsuga Tensho without his Zanpakutō fusing to his hand? We're really getting into the weeds here, this is getting very granular to be totally honest, and again, we don't really have the data necessary to know for sure, but it kind of feels like, based on the manga, on the surface, that the answer is no. The two kind of come hand in hand, no pun intended, which I guess brings me back round to my point involving Isshin. If he knew of the final Getsuga Tensho already, did he already know of the fusing between Zanpakutō and Shinigami in that sense? How did he know it and not Aizen? Especially since the idea of fusing Zanpakutō and Shinigami isn't something that's apparently specific to the Kurosaki lineage. I don't know, we're getting way off the reservation here with that one. Like I said, it's certainly interesting and I would love to know more, but it does feel like Kubo's answer conflicts with the admittedly very little that we know about the earliest days of what would, I guess, become the modern Shinigami. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Maybe I've missed something that's pretty obvious. Moving on, there isn't too much to say about the remaining topics, but I thought they were intriguing in their own right, and worthy of some time here. We've discussed the differing power levels and strengths of the various Bambis before on the channel, and Kubo himself has even answered a question pertaining to that very topic before, here on the Q&A. But this time someone had a question regarding Giselle specifically, and it reads as follows. I think Gigi would be stronger fighting on her own, using Volstendish and Heilig File, rather than relying on zombies. But is the reason she leaves so much to her zombies because she wants to take it easy, and because it's her personal hobby? I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure where this question is coming from per se, as Giselle has always struck me as specifically the kind of character to use her minions to fight for her, because she isn't quite as strong with her own techniques and innate power. She's the puppet master trope. I mean, obviously Giselle isn't weak, and I think Kubo said that her Blute is one of, if not the greatest of the Bambis, I think perhaps just behind Lil Toto if I remember correctly, but her entire shtick is getting people to attack her and then manipulating them via her blood. It doesn't really make sense to imagine her just going into battle purely by herself, using her holy form and her arrows, though we have seen her do that, specifically against Ichigo. And to be fair, with her enhanced Vollständisch, Giselle does have a number of abilities at her disposal that we don't see in the manga, such as Munchy Munchy Babies and Dancing Dead Boys Club. But even so, the core conceit of her power and of her character is the ability to zombify people, so there's no reason to assume she wouldn't use it. Anyway, Kubo responded, saying it's because she finds it fun to turn her enemies into zombies. Again, I feel like this is made pretty clear by the character herself, and Kubo kind of dodges the question of whether she'd be stronger or not, though I personally think him choosing not to answer is his way of saying that she wouldn't be stronger, but that's of course just conjecture on my part. But anyway, this feels like an answer that probably could have been gleaned by just watching the character at work, but also because the zombie is stupidly powerful in its own right. It goes beyond basically making Giselle immortal, and not using it in battle would be absurd. Giselle literally commands not just an army of Shinigami, but multiple captains all at once. So that kind of explains why she leaves, I think, so much to the zombies. And in fact, we kind of see how she fares once said zombies are taken away from her. Not very well. Now, in the last installment of the Klub Outside Q&A, we had a topic about Pernida's name. And this time, we have one about Mimihagi's name, so that's pretty cool. This one is perhaps slightly less interesting from a lore perspective, but it's more an insight into Kubo's own process, which I always enjoy. Anyway, he was asked the following question. Does the name Mimihagi-sama come from a combination of the Greek words mimos and hagios? To which Kubo replied, I knew mimos, in brackets meaning imitation or imitator, but I wasn't familiar with hagios, so I looked it up. It means sacred or holy, more precisely, something or someone separated from the profane world and dedicated to God. Though that's not the origin of the name, it's an interesting coincidence. The name Mimihagi-sama comes from mi, meaning body, plus hagu, meaning to join, plus an honorific prefix, mi, plus the honorific suffix, sama. So that's honestly a pretty cool insight, and a much more thorough breakdown than I was expecting into how Kubo came up with the name of such a peculiar character, such a strange and unusual, and let's be honest, unexpected addition to the world of Bleach in the right arm of the Soul King. And it makes a lot of sense too, since it seems to essentially mean to join one's body, but in a way that's revered. And of course, that is essentially what happens to Ukitake. Mimihagi offers up a portion of itself, and it physically joins Ukitake's body as a child to keep his sickness at bay, to stagnate it for the rest of his life. And of course, it's not like the Soul King, or even the right arm, once separated and having gained sentience, gave themselves that name. It was a name given to it by the residents of the Rukongai who worshipped this fallen, severed arm as a god. What's interesting to me is that clearly Mimihagi exists within other characters, within other Rukongai residents, not just Ukitake. Otherwise, why would the residents worship it? Why would they have named it this? Why would Ukitake's parents expect Mimihagi to be capable of helping their deathly ill child, unless it had been proven to be able to do so in the past with other examples? This particular name would have had to have originated from somewhere, and it's so specific, especially now with Kubo's thought process behind it. And so it seems likely they began calling it that once these first few miracles occurred, after its power, its essence, was discovered entangled within the konpaku of residents over time, perhaps. Maybe these residents were suffering from grave illnesses, and Mimihagi, having gained sentience and deciding to protect these people, helped them out of its own accord, at which point people began somehow to relate these miracles back to this strange severed arm. Although having thought about it a bit deeper, it's interesting that the residents of the Rukongai supposedly somehow garnered the idea that this arm did in fact belong to the Soul King, despite the fact that none of them have ever seen him before. I guess it's simply because the right arm fell from heaven, and so therefore they considered it had to have been godly, and they just happened to be right on the money. It did in fact belong to the Bleach universe's version of God. But I like the reader's line of thinking, though. While the idea of imitation or imitator doesn't necessarily make sense for Mimihagi, though I suppose you could argue the shadowy version of Mimihagi is an imitation of the real thing, that partitioned some of its power out to Ukitake, which is made much more explicit in the anime. The definition of hagios, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, something or someone separated from the profane world and dedicated to God, honestly suits Ukitake as the Kamikake Godsworn perfectly, which is really cool, and again is noted by Kubo himself as being an interesting coincidence. And then, as always, we've got a fairly quick topic to wrap things up with, as Kubo was asked the following question. Doesn't Kaido allow scars to be completely erased? If it's possible, do Shinigami who keep their scars do so intentionally? To which Kubo replied, if someone has Kaido at the level of Unohana or Isane, it is possible to heal a wound without leaving any scar at all. But there are various reasons why scars remain. Some choose not to remove them, while others simply cannot be erased. So this is actually quite interesting. First of all, it's made pretty clear, I thought, that certain Shinigami choose to keep their wounds for individual reasons, whether that's Kenpachi and Unohana's own scars they received from each other in their original battle that they left on their bodies to kind of act as a reminder of that original fight, or even Yamamoto's lost arm or Kyoraku's lost eye. Though to be totally honest, Kyoraku really probably should get that eye restored, even if having the eye patch does make him look like a badass. But Kubo notes that in order to heal a wound in such a way that it doesn't leave a scar, you need Kaido's skill on the level of Unohana or Isane, which is obviously top-shelf stuff within the Soul Society. So that means anyone not healed with a power of that level could potentially leave a scar. And interestingly, Kubo doesn't really say that it's possible to outright remove a scar, though I guess he does say that some do choose not to, implying it could possibly happen once it's manifested, merely that it's possible to heal someone without a scar appearing in the first place, though again I suspect Unohana could manage it. But more interestingly than that is this idea Kubo drops in right at the very end, that there are some scars that simply cannot be erased. And I wonder why that would be. What kind of an attack would constitute a scar that even someone like Unohana couldn't remove? While I don't have any specific examples, it does make me think back to Orihime trying to heal Ichigo after his first battle against Ulquiorra. Obviously, Orihime's healing is anything but orthodox, but that's actually more to the point. Orihime's rejection transcends even God's realm, and yet when Ulquiorra stabs Ichigo in the chest with his hand, Orihime finds that the lingering Reiatsu swirling around Ichigo's wound can't be rejected, at least not initially. Obviously, she eventually manages it, but it's intriguing that she experiences that at all, and it's not really something that gets brought up ever again. I suppose an attack on the level of Mugetsu would leave a scar. I mean, once Aizen has healed himself, obviously he doesn't have a scar, but I guess if you somehow survived it, though again that's such an extreme example, it would be impossible to erase that scar. Maybe it's just a case of when someone is struck by an attack, or such a wound is inflicted by a power that massively transcends even that of Unohana's, perhaps that is an example of when a scar could not be removed. Alright, but that's it for today's video for the latest installment of the Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series. As always, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm taking something of value away from it as well. Let me know down in the comments which of the topics was your favourite, which you found to be the most interesting. There's a lot to talk about regarding Zanpakutō fusion. It is, like I said, a concept that was kind of left behind in the Deicide arc after being introduced in the Deicide arc as well, but I would always love to know more. I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments below about Giselle's power level, her overall strength with or without Volstendish and the Heilig File and the zombies, no matter which version of her power she chooses to use essentially, what you think about the origin of Mimihagi's name, and of course about scars that can or cannot be healed. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, I'd love to read them. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already, help out the channel. It really does help out enormously on our quest to 300,000 subscribers. Again, I can't do it without you. It does mean the absolute world. Check out the Patreon as well to get your name in the credits of every single video at the $2 tier or higher. You can get all of my videos absolutely free of YouTube ads, so please consider doing that as well. Again, it is greatly appreciated and it does mean the absolute world. Alright everyone, until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.